Detective Ray Maxwell arrived at the scene under the flickering glow of streetlights, his unmarked car pulling up to the curb of a picturesque suburban home. The house, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, seemed like the last place for tragedy, yet the chaos spilling out of the front door told a different story. Inside, a child's room lay in disarray, stuffed animals tossed across the floor, a toy chest overturned, and a small window ajar with shattered glass glinting on the carpet. Maxwell's sharp eyes caught every detail, his mind already piecing together the story as he stepped in. Sarah Carter, the distraught mother, clutched a framed photo of her daughter, Lily. Her voice broke with terror as she spoke, her words tumbling out in frantic bursts. "She's gone. My baby girl is gone. I checked on her before bed, and now she's just gone." Maxwell's face, hardened by years of solving the city's darkest cases, softened for a brief moment. He nodded firmly, signaling her to sit. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to take a deep breath and tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Sarah's trembling hands covered her face as she tried to compose herself. Maxwell scanned Lily's room, his trained eye catching subtle clues. The shattered glass suggested forced entry, and the small footprints in the dirt outside the window hinted at a hurried escape. He crouched to examine the sill, noticing faint scratches as though someone had struggled to climb out. He turned back to Sarah, whose sobs were subsiding into shallow breaths. "There's no ransom note," she said, her voice cracking. "No phone call. Nothing. Who would do this? Why?" Maxwell's gaze lingered on her for a moment, taking in her disheveled hair, the tear-streaked makeup. "Where's Lily's father?" he asked. Sarah hesitated before replying. "He's out of town, business trip in Chicago. He doesn't even know yet." I don't know how to tell him." Maxwell nodded, his mind cataloging every detail. "We'll get to him shortly. For now, I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual lately." "Anything at all?" Sarah's eyes darted toward the window before she looked down. I thought I was being paranoid. For weeks, I felt like someone was watching us. I'd see a shadow across the street or hear footsteps outside at night, but when I checked, there was nothing. I thought I was imagining things." Maxwell's jaw tightened. He had heard this story before, too many times. Glancing back at the room, his eyes landed on something odd, a small, intricately carved wooden bird lying near Lily's bed. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The craftsmanship was delicate, almost obsessive. Pocketing it, he made a mental note to have it analyzed. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone measured but firm, "has anyone shown unusual interest in you or Lily? Anyone trying to get close to your family recently?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. "There was a man," she said slowly. "He approached me at the design studio. I'm an interior decorator, and he said he admired my work. He seemed harmless, but now, I don't know." Maxwell leaned in, his voice low. "Do you remember his name?" "David," she replied after a pause. "David Cole. He said he was an artist." Maxwell's mind began connecting dots. He stood and pulled out his phone, signaling one of the officers outside. "I'll need his full name and any contact information you have." "Don't worry, Mrs. Carter. We'll find her." Back at the precinct, Maxwell wasted no time. He called for an all-points bulletin on Lily Carter and set up an investigation team. "I want every resource we have on this," he told his team. "Background checks on every associate of the Carter family. Start with David Cole." He returned to Lily's room later that evening, combing through every detail. Among the scattered toys, he found a small sketchbook tucked under the bed. Flipping through its pages, his heart sank. The drawings were crude but unmistakable, images of a man standing outside a house, a child playing in a yard, a mother at her desk. All were signed with a looping DC. Maxwell's instincts screamed that David Cole was the key. He ordered his team to pull Cole's records, and what they found was troubling: a struggling artist with a history of stalking and harassment charges, though none had led to convictions. Maxwell's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Tracing Cole's phone, they located his last known address, a small studio in the Arts District. Maxwell led the team himself, but the studio was empty when they arrived. The air inside carried the faint scent of turpentine and linseed oil, the walls lined with canvases depicting birds in flight. As Maxwell searched the studio, he found a bus ticket tucked under a paint-stained rag. It was dated for the previous night, departing for a small town upstate. His pulse quickened. "He's running," Maxwell muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But why leave behind the painting supplies and unfinished work? Something didn't add up. Behind one of the larger canvases, he found a hidden message scrawled in pencil, a series of numbers. At first glance, they seemed random, but Maxwell recognized them: coordinates. Back at the precinct, Maxwell pored over the coordinates. They pointed to a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from any major roads. The lab results came in moments later. The wooden bird he had found in Lily's room bore Cole's fingerprints. Everything was converging. "We've got him," Maxwell said, his voice sharp with determination. He called for a tactical team. "We leave in 10. The drive to the cabin was tense. Maxwell sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, but there was no time to dwell on it. The wooded terrain grew denser as they approached the coordinates, the cabin finally coming into view as a faint silhouette against the darkening sky. The team moved in silently, their weapons drawn. Maxwell signaled the breach, and the door burst open with a deafening crash. Inside, David Cole sat in a chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He didn't flinch as the team surrounded him. "Where is she?" Maxwell demanded, his voice edged with fury. Cole looked up, his expression eerily serene. "She's safe," he said simply. "But you'll never understand." Maxwell's patience snapped. "Safe? You call this safe? Where is Lily?" Cole's calm demeanor cracked just slightly, a flicker of something darker passing over his face. "She's where she belongs," he said cryptically. Refusing to say more, he fell into silence, his eyes distant. Searching the cabin, the team found no trace of Lily, but Maxwell's eyes landed on a covered canvas leaning against the wall. Pulling the cloth away, he revealed a vivid painting of a beach, a place that seemed oddly familiar. His mind raced as he recalled Sarah mentioning a family trip to the coast last month. Could it be a clue? As Maxwell stared at the painting, a flashback pieced together Cole's obsession. Images of him watching Lily at the beach, sketching her from afar, played in Maxwell's mind like a film reel. This wasn't just a random act, it had been meticulously planned. Cole had been watching them for months. But the painting wasn't the only revelation. A search of Cole's phone records revealed a chilling connection. He had been in contact with someone else, someone who seemed to be pulling the strings. It wasn't just about Cole's obsession, it was part of something much bigger. Maxwell pressed Cole for answers, but the man remained tight-lipped. "You're just a pawn," Maxwell said, hoping to provoke him. "Who's behind this?" Cole smirked but said nothing. Maxwell's frustration boiled over, but he knew he had to stay focused. The painting led Maxwell to a new location, a desolate beach where the tide whispered secrets through the sand. The team found a small shack, its weathered walls barely holding together against the wind. Inside, the scene was haunting: a child's cot, a few scattered toys, and a broken music box playing a distorted lullaby. But no Lily. On the base of the music box, Maxwell found another set of coordinates. The game wasn't over. This time, it led to a deserted lighthouse perched on the edge of a rocky cliff. The final confrontation was near, and Maxwell felt the weight of every second ticking by. The lighthouse loomed like a ghost in the fog as the team approached. Inside, the winding staircase seemed endless, each step echoing with tension. At the top, they found Lily, curled up and trembling but alive. Maxwell's heart surged with relief, but the sound of a rifle being cocked snapped him back to reality. Sarah Carter stood near the light, her face twisted with anger. "You don't understand," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't about Lily. It was never about her. Maxwell's blood ran cold as the truth unfolded. Sarah had orchestrated everything, using Cole as a pawn in her quest for revenge against her own father, who had wronged her years ago. The final confrontation was brutal. Sarah fired a shot, narrowly missing Maxwell, but her rage made her reckless. Maxwell managed to disarm her, the two of them struggling until she was finally subdued. As she was led away in handcuffs, her eyes burned with defiance. "You think you've won?" she spat. This was never about winning. Back at the precinct, Maxwell pieced together the full story. Sarah's hatred had consumed her, leading her to manipulate Cole and put her daughter in danger. Lily was safe, but the scars of the ordeal would linger. Maxwell sat in his office, staring at a photo of his own daughter. The case had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also reminded him why he did this job. As the city lights twinkled outside his window, his phone buzzed with a new call. Another case. Another mystery. Maxwell stood, slipping on his coat. There was no rest for those who walked in the shadows, but he was ready. Always ready. The call came through as Maxwell was collecting his thoughts, the weight of the recent case still pressing heavily on his chest. The dispatcher's voice was sharp and clear: a missing person, a young man whose family hadn't heard from him in 48 hours. Maxwell's first instinct was to pass it off to another detective. His body ached, his mind was frayed, and his emotions were still raw from the Carter case. But something in the tone of the dispatcher's voice, the urgency, made him pause. He grabbed his coat and headed out into the night. The home of the missing young man, Tyler Grayson, was in a grittier part of the city, far removed from the pristine suburb where Lily Carter had disappeared. Maxwell arrived to find Tyler's parents waiting on the front steps, their faces etched with worry. The father, a stern-looking man with a graying beard, tried to maintain his composure, but his wife was less restrained, clutching at tissue as tears streamed down her face. "He's a good boy," she said, her voice trembling. "He's never done anything like this before. He always calls. Always." Maxwell nodded, his face unreadable but his eyes scanning the surroundings. "When was the last time you saw him?" he asked. The father cleared his throat, his voice rough. 2 nights ago. He went out to meet some friends, said he'd be back by midnight. But he never came home. We called his phone, but it's been going straight to voicemail." "And his friends?" Maxwell asked, pulling out a notepad. "Have you spoken to them?" The father shook his head. "We don't know who he was meeting. He just said he was going out. But Tyler's not the type to vanish. Something's wrong, I can feel it." Maxwell's eyes flicked to the mother, who was clutching a small framed photo of Tyler in his graduation robes. "Does he have a girlfriend? Anyone he might have gone to see?" The mother hesitated, then nodded. "There's a girl. Emma. They've been friends for years, but lately, I don't know. He's been spending more time with her." Maxwell jotted down the name. "Do you have an address for Emma?" The father pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "Here," he said, showing Maxwell the screen. Maxwell copied the address and stood, his mind already working through the possibilities. "We'll find him," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "I'll be in touch as soon as I know more." Emma's apartment was in a trendy neighborhood downtown, the kind of place where young professionals and artists brushed shoulders over overpriced coffee. Maxwell knocked on the door, the sound echoing down the quiet hallway. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a young woman with red-rimmed eyes and disheveled hair. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Emma?" Maxwell asked, holding up his badge. "Detective Maxwell. I need to ask you some questions about Tyler Grayson." Her eyes widened, and she stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but tidy, though the coffee table was cluttered with notebooks, a laptop, and an empty mug. Emma sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands. "Is Tyler okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what I'm trying to find out," Maxwell replied, taking a seat across from her. "When was the last time you saw him?" Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "2 nights ago. He came over for a while. We just talked, nothing unusual. Then he left around 10. He said he was meeting someone, but he didn't say who." Her voice broke slightly. "I thought he was fine. I didn't think anything was wrong." "Did he seem upset? Worried about anything?" Maxwell pressed. Emma shook her head. "No, he was normal. Maybe a little distracted, but Tyler's always been like that. He gets lost in his own head sometimes." Maxwell leaned forward, his tone softening. "Emma, if there's anything you're not telling me, now's the time. Even if it seems small, it could help." She hesitated, biting her lip. "There was one thing," she admitted. "A few weeks ago, Tyler mentioned someone had been following him. He thought it was nothing, just someone he kept seeing around campus. I told him to be careful, but he laughed it off." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "Did he describe this person? Give you any details?" Emma shook her head. "No, just that it was a man. He said it was probably just a coincidence." Maxwell stood, his mind racing. "If you think of anything else, call me," he said, handing her his card. "And stay safe." As Maxwell left the apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that Tyler's disappearance was more than a simple missing person case. The mention of someone following him, combined with the abrupt nature of his disappearance, set off alarm bells in Maxwell's mind. He headed back to the precinct, determined to dig deeper. Pulling up Tyler's records, Maxwell found that the young man was a college student studying environmental science. His grades were above average, and there was nothing in his background to suggest he'd run into trouble. But a search of his phone records revealed something interesting, a series of calls to an unknown number in the days leading up to his disappearance. Maxwell traced the number, finding it registered to a prepaid phone with no name attached. It was a dead end, but it confirmed his suspicion that Tyler had been in contact with someone he hadn't told his family or friends about. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Who was this mystery contact, and what did they want with Tyler? The next morning, Maxwell visited Tyler's college campus. He spoke with professors, classmates, and anyone who might have seen him in the days before he vanished. Most described Tyler as friendly but quiet, someone who kept to himself. But one classmate, a wiry young man named Ben, mentioned something that caught Maxwell's attention. "Tyler was acting weird last week," Ben said, shifting nervously. "He kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was watching him. I asked if he was okay, but he just shrugged it off." "Did he say anything about who might have been watching him?" Maxwell asked. Ben hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but he did mention something about meeting someone off campus. He said it was for a project, but he wouldn't say what it was about." A project. Maxwell's mind turned over the possibilities. Was Tyler involved in something dangerous? Or had he stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to know? The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. Returning to the precinct, Maxwell reviewed everything he had so far: Tyler's phone records, the mention of someone following him, and the mysterious project he'd been working on. It all pointed to something larger, something Tyler had gotten involved in that had put him in danger. As Maxwell stared at the evidence, a call came in from one of his colleagues. "We've got something," the officer said. "Traffic camera footage from 2 nights ago. Tyler was seen getting into a black sedan outside a coffee shop downtown." Maxwell's heart raced. "Did you get the plate number?" "Yeah," the officer replied. "We're running it now." Minutes later, the results came back. The car was registered to a Jason Crowley, a name that rang a faint bell in Maxwell's mind. Pulling up Crowley's records, Maxwell found he had a history of petty crimes, nothing major, but enough to raise suspicion. Crowley's last known address was a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Maxwell wasted no time. As he drove to the warehouse, his mind raced with possibilities. Was Crowley involved in Tyler's disappearance? Or was he just another piece of a larger puzzle? Maxwell knew one thing for certain: he was getting closer to the truth. And wherever the truth led, he was ready to follow. The warehouse loomed large in the dim light of the early evening, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and graffiti. Maxwell killed the engine a block away and approached on foot, his senses on high alert. He radioed for backup, but they were still several minutes out. He couldn't wait. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of the case pressing harder on his shoulders. The building was silent except for the distant hum of traffic from the nearby freeway. Maxwell moved cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The closer he got, the more signs of life he noticed. A faint glow of light seeped through a broken window, and the unmistakable sound of movement, shuffling, a chair scraping against concrete, drifted through the air. Someone was inside. He reached the door and tested it gently. It gave way with a soft creak, and he slipped inside, his steps muffled on the dusty floor. The interior smelled of oil and mildew, and the dim light from a single hanging bulb barely illuminated the space. The sound of muffled voices came from deeper within the building. Maxwell edged closer, his pulse quickening. Rounding a corner, he spotted two figures in the back of the room. One was seated, their hands tied behind their back, their heads slumped forward. The other stood over them, pacing back and forth. Maxwell strained to make out their faces, but couldn't see clearly from his position. He reached for his radio and whispered, "Suspect confirmed. Possible hostage. Need backup now." The pacing figure stopped abruptly, as if sensing something. Maxwell froze, holding his breath. The man turned slightly, his face catching the light, a gaunt, sharp-featured man who matched the DMV photo of Jason Crowley. He was speaking, his voice low and menacing, though Maxwell couldn't make out the words. The person in the chair shifted, letting out a muffled groan. Maxwell's heart sank. It was a young man, and though he couldn't see his face clearly, he was certain it was Tyler Grayson. Maxwell's grip on his weapon tightened. He couldn't wait any longer. "Police!" Maxwell shouted, stepping into the light. "Hands where I can see them." Crowley froze, his eyes darting to the doorway. For a moment, Maxwell thought he might surrender, but then Crowley bolted, knocking over a stack of crates as he ran toward the back exit. Maxwell cursed under his breath and ran toward Tyler first, quickly cutting the ropes binding him. Tyler's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he was alive. "Stay here," Maxwell ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. "Help is on the way." Tyler nodded weakly, his body trembling. Maxwell didn't wait for backup, he couldn't let Crowley get away. He sprinted toward the back exit, his adrenaline surging. The door slammed shut just as he reached it, and he burst through, finding himself in an alley behind the warehouse. Crowley was fleeing toward a chain-link fence, his movements clumsy but desperate. Maxwell shouted, "Stop! Don't make this worse." Crowley ignored him, scrambling up the fence. Maxwell raised his gun but hesitated, firing wasn't an option unless Crowley posed an immediate threat. Instead, Maxwell chased him. He jumped and grabbed the fence, hauling himself over with surprising speed for a man his age. Crowley had a head start, but Maxwell was relentless, his boots pounding against the asphalt as he closed the distance. Crowley darted into a narrow alley, but it was a mistake, the dead end loomed ahead. "End of the line, Crowley!" Maxwell shouted, his weapon drawn and aimed. Crowley turned, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "You don't understand," he shouted. "This isn't about me." Maxwell advanced slowly, his voice steady. "Then tell me who it's about. Who are you working for?" Crowley's hands twitched at his sides, and for a moment, Maxwell thought he might try something stupid. But instead, Crowley sank to his knees, his head hanging low. You don't know what you're dealing with, he muttered. They'll come for me. They'll come for all of us. Maxwell didn't lower his weapon. Who's coming? Crowley looked up, his face a mask of fear and despair. You'll never stop them. I was just the middleman. They've already taken him. Maxwell frowned, his confusion and frustration mounting. Taken who? Tyler's safe. He's back at the warehouse. Crowley let out a hollow laugh. You think it's just about him? This goes deeper than you can imagine. Before Maxwell could press further, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Crowley's expression hardened. It's too late. You'll see. Backup arrived moments later, officers swarming the alley and taking Crowley into custody. Maxwell watched silently as they hauled him away, the man's words lingering in his mind. Back at the warehouse, Tyler was being checked over by EMTs. He was shaken but unharmed, though he had little to offer in terms of answers. I don't know who they were, Tyler said, his voice hoarse. Crowley wasn't the only one. There were others. They kept asking me about documents. Something I was supposed to have. Maxwell leaned in, his brow furrowed. What documents? What are they looking for? Tyler shook his head. I don't know. I don't have anything like that. I swear. Maxwell believed him, but that only deepened the mystery. What had Tyler stumbled into? And who were the others Crowley had mentioned? As the EMTs loaded Tyler into the ambulance, Maxwell's phone buzzed. It was a text from the lab, results on the wooden bird from the Carter case. The timing sent a chill down Maxwell's spine. He opened the text and read the report. The carving wasn't just linked to Cole's fingerprints. It also had traces of a rare type of varnish used by only a handful of artisans in the region. One of those artisans had a direct connection to Jason Crowley. The cases were connected. Maxwell's blood ran cold. He had thought the Carter case was closed, but now it seemed like it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And if Crowley's cryptic warnings were to be believed, the danger was far from over. Maxwell stood in the alley, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in his mind. Tyler was safe for now, but the shadow that had taken Lily, that had manipulated Cole, was still out there. And it was watching. The weight of the connection between the cases hit Maxwell like a gut punch. He couldn't shake the sense that he was standing on the edge of something vast and insidious, a web of crimes that extended far beyond what he'd uncovered so far. But if what Crowley had said was true, then there was more at play here, something darker, more dangerous. Back at the precinct, Maxwell stared at his whiteboard, where photographs, notes, and timelines for both cases were tacked up in an increasingly chaotic array. Lily Carter's abduction. David Cole's obsession. Sarah Carter's twisted revenge. Tyler Grayson's disappearance. Jason Crowley's cryptic warnings. And now, the wooden bird, with its strange varnish that linked it all together. He felt like he was chasing shadows, every answer leading to more questions. Crowley was in interrogation now, sitting in a cold, gray room with two officers keeping watch. Maxwell knew he had to play this carefully. If Crowley was indeed a pawn in something larger, pushing too hard might make him clam up. But time wasn't on Maxwell's side. If there were others involved, they wouldn't sit idle for long. Maxwell stepped into the interrogation room and shut the door behind him. Crowley sat slouched in his chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. His earlier defiance had faded, replaced by a weary resignation. "You're in deep, Crowley," Maxwell began, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Kidnapping. False imprisonment. God knows what else. If you cooperate, maybe the DA will go easy on you. But if you keep stonewalling, you're going down for this alone." Crowley scoffed, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think I'm afraid of prison? You don't get it, do you? None of this matters. Not me, not you, not your little rescue mission. They're always 5 steps ahead." "They," Maxwell repeated, leaning forward. "You keep saying they. Who are you talking about? Who's pulling the strings? Crowley hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Maxwell thought he wouldn't answer. But then Crowley leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. You ever hear of the Black Hollow Society? The name sent a shiver down Maxwell's spine. He'd heard it before, whispered among conspiracy theorists and investigative reporters chasing dead ends. A secretive organization rumored to operate in the shadows, pulling strings in politics, finance, and even law enforcement. Most dismissed it as urban legend, a bogeyman for the paranoid. But Maxwell wasn't so sure anymore. What's their connection to this? Maxwell pressed. Why would they target Tyler Grayson? Or Lily Carter? Crowley's eyes flicked to the corner of the room, as if expecting someone to burst in. They don't care about the people, he said. They care about leverage. Information. Tyler stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. And Lily, she was just collateral damage. A way to send a message. Maxwell's stomach churned. If Crowley was telling the truth, then this wasn't just about a kidnapping or a missing person. It was about control, power, and fear. And if the Black Hollow Society really was involved, then Maxwell was in way over his head. Where are they now? Maxwell demanded. Where's the rest of the society? Crowley laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You think I know? I'm nothing to them. A disposable pawn. They gave me orders, and I followed them. That's it. But if I were you, I'd start looking into that bird. It's not just some carving. It's a marker. Before Maxwell could press him further, Crowley leaned back in his chair and clammed up, his expression turning cold. Maxwell knew he wouldn't get anything else out of him tonight. He left the room, his mind racing. A marker. What did that mean? Was the wooden bird some kind of calling card? A warning? Or something else entirely? Maxwell returned to his desk and pulled out the evidence bag containing the wooden bird. He turned it over in his hands, studying the intricate carvings. It was beautifully crafted, almost too perfect. And then he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint inscription etched along the base. It was barely visible, but under the right light, the letters became clear, Vox Silentium. Latin. Maxwell wasn't fluent, but he recognized the phrase. The silent voice. It was cryptic, but it felt deliberate, like a clue meant to be uncovered. He grabbed his phone and called Dana, the precinct's tech analyst and his go-to for anything obscure. Dana, I need you to look something up for me, he said as soon as she answered. Vox Silentium. It's Latin. See if it connects to anything. On it, Dana replied, her fingers already clicking away on her keyboard. Give me a minute. While he waited, Maxwell stared at the bird, turning it over and over in his hands. What was its significance? Why leave it at the scene of Lily's abduction? And how did it tie into Tyler's disappearance? Dana's voice broke through his thoughts. Okay, I found something. Vox Silentium is the name of a private auction house. Super exclusive, invite only. They specialize in rare artifacts, but they've been linked to some shady dealings, smuggling, black market trades, that kind of thing. Maxwell frowned. An auction house? How does that tie into a child abduction? I don't know yet, Dana admitted. But get this, they've got an event coming up. Tomorrow night. And guess where it's being held? Where? Maxwell asked, bracing himself. An old estate just outside the city, Dana said. Owned by a shell corporation. No names attached, but it's rumored to be a Black Hollow Society property. Maxwell felt his pulse quicken. It couldn't be a coincidence. Send me the details, he said. And find out how I can get in. As soon as he hung up, Maxwell's phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. You're in too deep. Walk away. Maxwell stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Whoever had sent the message knew he was getting close. But the warning only fueled his determination. He wasn't about to walk away, not now, not when lives were at stake. The next evening, Maxwell stood outside the gates of the sprawling estate, his heart pounding in his chest. He had managed to secure a spot at the auction by posing as a buyer, using fake credentials Dana had whipped up. Inside, he knew, were people who could lead him to the truth. But this was dangerous territory. If the Black Hollow Society was as powerful as Crowley claimed, then Maxwell was walking straight into the lion's den. Squaring his shoulders, he stepped through the gates, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Maxwell entered the estate under the guise of a wealthy collector, his sharp suit and confident demeanor masking the tension coiling in his chest. The estate itself was a monument to excess. Ornate chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and the marble floors gleamed beneath his polished shoes. Waiters in crisp uniforms floated between the guests, offering champagne flutes on silver trays as a murmur of conversation filled the grand hall. The attendees were a mix of old money and shadowy figures, their faces carefully composed but their eyes sharp with calculation. Maxwell moved through the room slowly, scanning the crowd for anything or anyone that might give him a lead. He felt out of place, his instincts screaming that he was being watched. And yet, he knew he couldn't afford to falter. If the Black Hollow Society was truly behind this was his best shot at getting closer to the truth. A man in a dark suit approached, his face smooth but his eyes cold. "Mr. Turner, I presume," the man said, addressing Maxwell by the alias on his forged credentials. Maxwell nodded, his voice calm. "That's right. I was told tonight's auction would be enlightening." The man smirked, a flicker of amusement crossing his features. "Indeed. Follow me. The auction is about to begin." Maxwell followed him through a set of heavy oak doors into a smaller, more intimate room. The atmosphere shifted immediately. What had been light and sociable in the main hall now felt heavy and clandestine. Rows of chairs were arranged before a raised platform, where a podium stood beneath a single spotlight. On the walls, dark, abstract paintings loomed, their shapes unsettling and difficult to define. The attendees filed in, taking their seats with an air of quiet anticipation. Maxwell chose a spot near the back, his instincts telling him to stay inconspicuous. He scanned the room, noting the faces around him. Some were familiar, local power players whose names had crossed his desk in past cases. Others were complete strangers, their anonymity unsettling. The lights dimmed further, and a tall woman in an elegant black dress stepped onto the platform. Her presence commanded silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and practiced, "welcome to tonight's event. As always, discretion is paramount. What is seen and heard here stays within these walls." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Maxwell felt a chill run down his spine. The air in the room was thick with secrecy, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to keep the truth hidden. The auction began with items that seemed innocuous enough: rare paintings, ancient artifacts, even a set of antique coins. But as the evening progressed, the lots grew stranger. A ceremonial dagger with a blood-stained history. A diary purportedly written by a long-dead cult leader. And then, something that made Maxwell's pulse quicken: a small, intricately carved wooden bird, nearly identical to the one found in Lily Carter's room. "This piece," the auctioneer said, gesturing toward the bird displayed in a glass case, "is one of a kind. Hand-carved and treated with a rare varnish, it is believed to be a marker used by an ancient order as a symbol of initiation." Maxwell's mind raced. A marker. Crowley's words echoed in his ears. This wasn't just a coincidence, this was a breadcrumb, deliberately placed. But why auction it off? Was it meant to send a message, or was it bait for someone like him? The bidding began, and Maxwell forced himself to stay calm, raising his paddle at calculated intervals. The price climbed quickly, and he could feel the eyes of the other bidders on him, assessing, calculating. Was he drawing too much attention? He couldn't stop now, the bird was too important. Finally, the auctioneer's gavel struck the podium. "Sold to Mr. Turner," she announced. Maxwell nodded, his face impassive, though his heart was pounding. He had the bird, but he'd also placed himself squarely in the spotlight. As the auction continued, Maxwell's attention drifted. He studied the others in the room, searching for any sign of recognition or suspicion. But the faces around him remained unreadable, their expressions carefully neutral. When the auction concluded, the attendees began to disperse, some retreating into side rooms for whispered conversations, others heading for the exits. Maxwell stayed near the back, waiting for an opportunity to slip away unnoticed. But before he could move, the man who had greeted him earlier appeared at his side. "Congratulations on your purchase," the man said, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. "That particular piece has a storied history." Maxwell forced a faint smile. "That's what I'm counting on. I've always been drawn to items with a bit of mystery." The man's eyes lingered on him for a moment, as though searching for cracks in his facade. "Mystery is one thing," he said finally. "But some mysteries are better left unsolved." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Maxwell with a sense of unease that settled deep in his gut. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Clutching the receipt for the wooden bird, he made his way to the collection room, where the item was being prepared for him. The attendant handed him the glass case containing the bird, her expression unreadable. "Enjoy your purchase," she said, her tone flat. Maxwell gave a curt nod and left, his senses on high alert as he exited the estate. The night air was cool against his skin as he reached his car. He placed the glass case carefully on the passenger seat, his mind racing. The bird was a clue, but it was also a risk. If the Black Hollow Society really was watching, they would know he had it. And they wouldn't let him keep it without a fight. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Dana, got hits on the name Vox Silentium. They aren't just an auction house. They're tied to offshore accounts funneling money to shell companies across the country. One of those companies owns property near the docks. Coordinates attached. Maxwell glanced at the coordinates, then at the bird beside him. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far from complete. He knew one thing for certain: the docks would be his next stop. Whatever waited for him there, he was ready, or so he told himself. The drive was tense, every shadow along the road a potential threat. Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, though his mirrors revealed nothing out of the ordinary. When he arrived at the docks, the air was thick with the smell of salt and rust. The water lapped gently against the pilings, the sound eerie in the stillness of the night. The coordinates led him to a decrepit warehouse, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with grime. Maxwell parked a block away and approached on foot, his weapon drawn. He moved silently, his steps muffled by the damp earth beneath his boots. Inside, the warehouse was dark and cavernous, the air cold and damp. Maxwell's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating stacks of crates and coils of rope. At first, the place seemed abandoned, but then he heard it, a faint voice, muffled and distant. He followed the sound, his heart pounding. The voice led him to a locked door. Maxwell pressed his ear against it, straining to make out the words. It was a man, speaking urgently, though the words were indistinct. Maxwell tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He stepped back and aimed his weapon at the lock, firing a single shot that echoed through the warehouse. The door swung open, revealing a small room lit by a single dangling bulb. Inside, a man sat tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloodied. He looked up as Maxwell entered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Who are you?" Maxwell demanded, stepping closer. "What's going on here?" The man's voice was hoarse. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into. They're coming. They'll kill us all." Before Maxwell could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. They weren't alone. Maxwell reacted instinctively, stepping to the side of the doorway to shield himself from view. He motioned for the man in the chair to stay silent, his finger pressed against his lips. The footsteps grew louder, measured and deliberate, the sound of boots on concrete reverberating through the cavernous warehouse. Whoever was coming wasn't in a rush, they wanted to be heard. Maxwell drew his weapon, his mind racing. He had no idea how many people were out there, but the calculated pace of the approaching steps suggested confidence. This wasn't a random group of thugs. These were professionals, and they knew exactly where to find him. He glanced at the man in the chair, whose face had gone pale. "Who's coming?" Maxwell whispered harshly. "Is it them? The Black Hollow Society?" The man nodded shakily, his lips trembling. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "You've drawn their attention. They'll kill you just for being here." Maxwell tightened his grip on his weapon, his jaw clenching. "Not if I kill them first." The footsteps stopped just outside the room. A shadow moved across the doorway, one figure, maybe two. Maxwell's pulse thundered in his ears as he braced himself. The silence that followed was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, without warning, the doorframe exploded in a spray of splinters as something heavy slammed into it, a battering ram. Maxwell dove to the side as the door was forced open, nearly torn from its hinges. Two figures in tactical gear stormed in, their faces obscured by masks. Maxwell didn't hesitate. He fired twice, his shots aimed low to incapacitate rather than kill. One of the intruders crumpled with a cry, clutching his leg, but the second moved with alarming speed, ducking behind a stack of crates for cover. "Drop your weapon," a voice barked, deep and commanding. It came not from the room, but from the hall outside, where at least one more figure was waiting. "You're outnumbered, detective. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." Maxwell's eyes darted to the man in the chair, who was shaking his head frantically. "Don't trust them," the man hissed. "They'll kill you no matter what." The masked intruder behind the crates fired a shot, the bullet ricocheting off the wall near Maxwell's head. He ducked lower, adrenaline surging through his veins. He was pinned, outmanned, and outgunned, but surrender wasn't an option. He had to think fast. His eyes scanned the room, searching for anything he could use. His gaze landed on a stack of rusted metal barrels in the corner. An idea sparked. He fired a single shot at the base of the barrels, the impact sending them toppling over with a deafening crash. The distraction gave him just enough time to move, slipping behind another set of crates as the intruders adjusted their positions. "Last warning, detective," the voice from the hall shouted. "Put the gun down, and we'll let you walk out of here alive." Maxwell barked back, his voice filled with defiance. "You're lying. You don't leave loose ends. So come and get me." The room erupted into chaos. The second intruder charged, firing as he moved. Maxwell returned fire, his aim precise. The man went down, his weapon clattering to the floor. But before Maxwell could catch his breath, a flashbang grenade rolled into the room, its metallic clink sending a jolt of dread through him. "Cover your eyes," Maxwell shouted, diving toward the man in the chair. He wrapped his arms around the man's head, shielding him as the grenade detonated with a blinding flash and an ear-splitting bang. Maxwell's vision swam, his ears ringing, but he forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford to lose control now. Through the haze, he saw the third intruder enter the room, a towering figure with a rifle trained on him. Maxwell fired blindly, his shots forcing the man to take cover. He grabbed the chair, dragging the bound man with him as he retreated toward the back of the room. His free hand fumbled for his radio, but it was useless, the blast had fried the signal. "Detective Maxwell," the voice called again, closer now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Give us the informant, and we'll let you walk away." Maxwell gritted his teeth. "You really expect me to believe that?" A low chuckle echoed through the room. "Believe what you want. But you're running out of options." Maxwell's mind worked furiously. He needed to level the playing field, and fast. His eyes darted to the ceiling, where a rusted chain dangled from a pulley system. An idea took shape, risky but his only chance. He whispered to the man in the chair, "When I say move, you move. Got it?" The man nodded weakly, his fear evident but his trust in Maxwell unshaken. Maxwell fired another shot, this time at the pulley's release lever. The chain snapped free, sending a heavy beam crashing to the ground. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring the room and creating the cover Maxwell needed. He grabbed the man and bolted for the side door, his heart pounding as he heard shouts and footsteps behind him. The cold night air hit him like a slap as they burst out of the warehouse. Maxwell didn't stop, half dragging, half carrying the man toward his car. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whizzing past as they reached the vehicle. Maxwell shoved the man into the passenger seat and dove into the driver's side, slamming the door just as a bullet shattered the rear window. He floored the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. In the rearview mirror, he saw the remaining intruders emerging from the warehouse, their faces obscured but their intent clear. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Maxwell gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had the informant, but he still didn't know the full scope of what he was up against. The Black Hollow Society had revealed their hand tonight, and it was far deadlier than he could have imagined. The man beside him groaned, his head lolling to the side. Maxwell glanced at him, his voice firm but urgent. "Who are they? What do they want?" The man coughed, his voice barely audible. "They want the ledger. I took it. Names, accounts, everything. It's the key to taking them down." Maxwell's grip tightened on the wheel. A ledger. It was always about information, about control. And now he had the one thing the Black Hollow Society couldn't afford to lose. As the city lights loomed ahead, Maxwell knew the game had changed. He wasn't just chasing shadows anymore, he was holding the light that could expose them. But the question remained, how far would they go to silence him? And was he prepared to face what came next? Maxwell's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, weaving through the dimly lit streets at breakneck speed. He could still hear the phantom echo of gunfire in his ears, the shattered rear window a reminder that the Black Hollow Society wasn't playing games. The man in the passenger seat wheezed, clutching his ribs as blood trickled from a gash on his temple. His words replayed in Maxwell's mind like a broken record, the ledger, names, accounts, everything. It's the key to taking them down. Where is it? Maxwell asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the car. He glanced at the man, who was barely holding himself together. Where's the ledger? The man coughed, his breath rattling as he struggled to speak. Safe house, a storage unit, near the industrial park. Unit 47B. His words came in gasps, each syllable dragging out as if it cost him a piece of his soul. But they know, they'll be there. Maxwell's jaw tightened. He didn't doubt that the Black Hollow Society had already anticipated his next move. They had resources, influence, and people everywhere. But he had no choice. If this ledger was as damning as the informant suggested, it could dismantle the entire operation, a shadowy empire brought to its knees by cold, hard evidence. I'll get us there, Maxwell said, trying to inject confidence into his voice, though he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But you need to hold it together. I need you alive to tell me everything. The man nodded weakly, his head lolling to the side as the adrenaline began to wear off. Maxwell cursed under his breath. He needed to move fast. The industrial park wasn't far, but it felt like the distance stretched endlessly, every intersection a potential ambush, every passing car a possible tail. He kept checking his mirrors, half expecting a convoy of black SUVs to come roaring up behind them. When he reached the industrial park, it was exactly as he remembered it, desolate, with rows of rusted storage units lined up like tombstones under the faint glow of flickering streetlights. The place smelled of oil and decay, the silence oppressive. Maxwell pulled the car into a shadowed corner, cutting the engine and scanning the area. Stay here, he told the man, who looked barely conscious. Lock the doors. Don't move unless I come back. Got it? The man nodded faintly, but Maxwell wasn't sure how much he comprehended. He double-checked his weapon, tucking an extra magazine into his jacket pocket before stepping out of the car. The air was cold, biting, as he moved toward the rows of storage units. His footsteps were soft, deliberate, his senses heightened. Every creak of metal, every distant hum of machinery put him on edge. Unit 47B was near the back, its metal door indistinguishable from the others except for the faint scuff marks near the handle, as though someone had tried to force it open recently. Maxwell crouched low, examining the lock, a heavy-duty padlock, scratched but intact. He pulled a small set of lockpicks from his pocket, a skill he'd picked up years ago in undercover work. His hands moved quickly but carefully, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. The lock clicked open, and Maxwell slid the door up just enough to slip inside. The interior was dark and cramped, the faint smell of dust and mold hanging in the air. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting across rows of boxes and file cabinets. His eyes scanned the labels hastily scrawled on the sides of the boxes: contracts, shipping logs, personnel. It was all incriminating, but not what he was looking for. Then he saw it, a metal lockbox tucked in the corner, partially hidden under a pile of old tarps. Maxwell's pulse quickened as he approached it, his flashlight illuminating the faint letters stenciled on the side: 47B, Master Ledger. He knelt, running his fingers over the box. It was heavier than he expected, the metal cold and unyielding. He had just begun to examine the lock on the box when a faint noise reached his ears, a shuffle of footsteps outside the unit. Maxwell froze, his heart pounding. He killed the flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, his weapon drawn and pointed toward the entrance. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one person, it was several. A voice called out, low and mocking. "Detective Maxwell. We know you're in there. Why don't you make this easy on yourself?" Maxwell's grip on his gun tightened. He recognized the voice. It was the same man who had spoken to him at the auction, the one with the cold eyes and the warning about mysteries best left unsolved. The Black Hollow Society hadn't just anticipated his move, they had been waiting for him. "Funny," Maxwell called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I was just about to say the same thing to you." Laughter echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of a weapon being cocked. "You're outnumbered, Detective. Hand over the ledger, and we'll let you walk out of here." "Yeah, I've heard that one before," Maxwell muttered under his breath. He glanced around the unit, his mind racing. The space was small, with no other exits. He was cornered, but that didn't mean he was out of options. His eyes landed on a stack of propane canisters near the back wall. They were old, likely abandoned when the unit's previous tenant had vacated, but they might still be full. Maxwell fired a single shot into the canisters. The resulting explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough to blow out the back wall of the unit, sending debris flying and filling the air with smoke and chaos. Shouts erupted outside as his attackers scrambled to react. Maxwell didn't wait. He grabbed the lockbox and bolted through the hole in the wall, staying low as he darted between rows of storage units. The night was alive with chaos now. Flashlights swept through the industrial park, voices barking orders as the Black Hollow Society's operatives fanned out in search of him. Maxwell kept moving, his every step calculated, his mind focused on one goal: get back to the car. When he finally reached it, the informant was slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow but steady. Maxwell threw the lockbox into the back seat and jumped behind the wheel, turning the ignition just as a black SUV came roaring into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "Hold on," Maxwell growled, slamming the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as he tore out of the industrial park with the SUV in pursuit. Bullets pinged off the rear of the car, but Maxwell didn't slow down. He weaved through the empty streets, his movements precise but desperate. The chase was relentless, the SUV gaining ground with every turn. Maxwell's mind raced. He couldn't lead them back to the precinct or anywhere public. He needed to end this, and fast. Up ahead, he spotted an old bridge under construction, its middle section missing. A plan formed in his mind, reckless but his only shot. He gunned the engine, the car hurtling toward the bridge at breakneck speed. Behind him, the SUV followed, its driver unaware of the danger. At the last possible moment, Maxwell veered hard, slamming the car into a construction barrier and bringing it to a screeching halt. The SUV wasn't as lucky. It barreled forward, its headlights illuminating the gaping hole in the bridge just before it plunged into the abyss. Maxwell sat in the driver's seat, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The informant groaned softly beside him, but he was alive. And in the back seat, the lockbox sat untouched, its contents the key to everything. For the first time that night, Maxwell allowed himself a moment of hope. The Black Hollow Society had made their move, but he had survived. Now it was his turn to strike back. Maxwell sat in the car for a moment longer, the sound of his own breathing loud in the silence that followed. His knuckles were still tight around the steering wheel, his body vibrating with the aftershocks of adrenaline. The bridge, now eerily quiet save for the faint echo of water below, was a temporary reprieve. But he knew the Black Hollow Society wasn't finished, not by a long shot. They would regroup, adapt, and come after him again. They always did. The informant beside him stirred, his voice a raspy whisper. "The ledger, you need to open it. You need to see what's inside." Maxwell turned to him, his face grim. "Not here. We're too exposed. You're barely hanging on, and I need answers. First, I'm getting you somewhere safe." The man shook his head weakly, his eyes unfocused. "There's no safe place, not from them." Maxwell ignored the protest. He had a safe house, one he rarely used, but kept prepped for emergencies like this. It wasn't far, tucked away in a quiet residential neighborhood that the society would have no reason to suspect. He started the car and drove, careful to stick to side streets and avoid any main roads where he might be spotted. The safe house was nondescript, a weathered single-story home with faded shutters and a cracked driveway. Maxwell pulled into the garage, shutting the door behind him before cutting the engine. He grabbed the lockbox and helped the informant inside, guiding him to the couch. The man slumped down, his breathing labored. "Stay here," Maxwell ordered, already moving to grab the first aid kit he kept under the kitchen sink. He returned quickly, cleaning the gash on the man's temple and wrapping it with gauze. "You need rest," Maxwell said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But first, I need you to tell me everything. Who are you? And why is this ledger so important?" The man winced, his fingers twitching as if the act of speaking would drain the last of his energy. My name is Martin Klein," he said finally. "I was one of them. Not high up, but enough to know how they operate." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "The Black Hollow Society?" Klein nodded weakly. "I handled logistics. Shipping routes, payment transfers, property acquisitions. They keep everything compartmentalized, no one has the full picture. But I saw enough to realize what I was a part of. The disappearances, the bribes, he trailed off, his face pale. They control everything, detective. Politicians, law enforcement, corporations. If you try to fight them, they'll bury you." Maxwell leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Then why did you run? Why take the ledger?" Klein closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to continue. "Because of the children," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "They're trafficking them. Using them as leverage, pawns in their power plays. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. The ledger, it's a record of every deal, every transaction. Proof of what they've done. It's enough to take them down, but only if it gets into the right hands." Maxwell felt his stomach churn. The weight of Klein's words hit him hard, anger mixing with a sickening sense of dread. He had suspected the society was involved in dark dealings, but this was worse than he had imagined. He glanced at the lockbox sitting on the coffee table. "And the ledger's in there?" Klein nodded. "But it's encrypted. You'll need the passcode." Maxwell grabbed the lockbox, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "What's the code?" Klein hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "Promise me," he said, his voice trembling. "Promise me you'll use it. That you'll expose them, no matter what." Maxwell met his gaze, his expression hard. "I promise." Klein exhaled shakily and leaned back against the couch. "It's 1-9-8-4, he said. "The years they were founded." Maxwell entered the code, the lockbox clicking open with a satisfying snap. Inside was a sleek, black hard drive, its surface unmarked except for a faint engraving of the phrase Vox Silentium. Next to it was a thin manila envelope. Maxwell opened the envelope and found a set of photographs and printed documents, just a taste of what the hard drive likely contained. The images showed faces, names, transactions, and locations. Each one painted a damning picture of the society's operations. "This is it," Maxwell muttered, his mind already racing. "This is enough to bring them down." But as he stared at the evidence, a sinking realization hit him. If the society knew Klein had the ledger, they would stop at nothing to retrieve it. And now that Maxwell had it, he had painted a target on his own back. He looked back at Klein, who was fading fast, his head lolling to the side. "Hey," Maxwell said, shaking him gently. "Stay with me. I need you to tell me more. Who else is involved? Who's running this?" Klein's eyes fluttered open, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a man, they call him the broker. He's the one who ties it all together. He doesn't just work for the society, he is the society. If you want to stop them, you have to find him." Maxwell's brow furrowed. "Where is he?" Klein's lips parted as if to answer, but no sound came. His body went limp, his breathing shallow and uneven. Maxwell checked his pulse, it was weak but still there. Klein needed medical attention, but taking him to a hospital would risk exposing their location. Maxwell's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he hesitated, then answered. "You've made a grave mistake, Detective," a smooth, chilling voice said on the other end. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Maxwell's jaw clenched. "If you're calling to threaten me, get in line." The voice chuckled, low and deliberate. "This isn't a threat. It's a warning. You don't know what you're dealing with. Return the ledger, and we'll let you walk away. But if you persist, well, let's just say your little friend won't be the only casualty." Maxwell's grip tightened on the phone. "You tell your boss I'm coming for him. And when I find him, there won't be anywhere left to hide." The line went dead. Maxwell set the phone down, his mind already racing through his next steps. Klein was right, there was no safe place, not for either of them. But he wasn't about to back down. He had the ledger, and now he had a name, the broker. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. The society had made it clear they were willing to destroy anyone who crossed them. But Maxwell had made a choice, he wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. And he wasn't going to stop until the Black Hollow Society was nothing but ashes. Maxwell sat in the dimly lit safe house, his jaw clenched as he stared at the hard drive sitting on the coffee table. The weight of what he now possessed was suffocating. The ledger wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon, one powerful enough to dismantle the Black Hollow Society if wielded correctly. But it was also a beacon, drawing the eyes of dangerous people who would stop at nothing to silence him. Martin Klein's ragged breathing filled the room, a reminder of how far the society was willing to go. He had two options. He could take the ledger to the authorities and hope that someone in the chain of command wasn't already compromised, or he could go after the society himself, striking at its heart. Maxwell knew the risks of both, but the voice on the phone had made one thing clear: there were no rules anymore. This was personal. His phone buzzed again, startling him. It was a text from Dana, the tech analyst who had been his lifeline throughout the case. The message was simple: tracked a lead on the broker. Sending coordinates. Be careful. This is big. A map link appeared below the text, directing him to a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Maxwell's stomach tightened. Another estate, another den of secrets. If the broker was there, this was his chance to cut off the head of the snake. But he needed to be smart. He couldn't just walk in guns blazing. Maxwell turned to Klein, who was barely conscious. "I need you to hang on," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm going to end this. For you, for the kids, for everyone they've hurt." Klein's eyes flickered open briefly. "Be careful," he rasped. "They see everything." Maxwell nodded grimly. He grabbed the hard drive and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, then secured the lockbox with the remaining documents in a hidden compartment under the floorboards of the safe house. If he didn't come back, someone would find it. The estate loomed ahead, its silhouette cutting into the night sky like a shadowed fortress. Maxwell parked a mile away and approached on foot, his weapon holstered but ready. The property was surrounded by high walls and patrolled by guards with military precision. Dana's intel had included a blueprint of the estate, highlighting weak points in the perimeter. Maxwell crept through the underbrush, his movements silent as he approached a service entrance near the back. He bypassed the lock with ease, slipping inside the grounds. The estate was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. He kept to the shadows, moving toward the main building. As he approached, he spotted an open window on the second floor. It was a risk, but it was his best chance of avoiding detection. Maxwell climbed up a trellis, his muscles straining as he hauled himself onto the windowsill. He slipped inside and found himself in a study lined with shelves of leather-bound books. A single desk lamp cast a warm glow over the room, and on the desk sat a laptop, its screen glowing faintly. Maxwell moved toward it, his instincts telling him this was too easy. The laptop was unlocked, its screen displaying a file directory. At the top of the list was a folder labeled Operations. Maxwell clicked on it, revealing a treasure trove of documents, each one detailing the Society's activities. He quickly inserted a USB drive into the laptop, copying everything. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it, proof, leverage, a way to end the Society's reign. But as the progress bar filled, the door to the study creaked open behind him. Maxwell spun around, his weapon drawn, only to find himself face to face with a man in a tailored black suit. His features were sharp, his silver hair slicked back, and his eyes cold and calculating. "Detective Maxwell," the man said smoothly, stepping into the room. "I've been expecting you." Maxwell's finger hovered over the trigger. "The broker, I presume?" The man smiled faintly. "Titles are so pedestrian. But yes, I represent the interests of the Society. And I must say, you've been quite the thorn in our side." "Your side?" Maxwell barked, his voice low but venomous. "You mean the side that traffics children and destroys lives?" The broker's smile didn't falter. "Spare me the morality play. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a man with a gun and a grudge. You don't understand the scale of what you're dealing with. The Society isn't an organization, it's an idea. You can't kill an idea." Maxwell's grip on his weapon tightened. "Maybe not. But I can kill you." Before the broker could respond, Maxwell fired. The broker moved with startling speed, diving behind the desk as the bullet shattered a framed painting on the wall. Alarms blared, red lights flooding the room as the estate's security was activated. Maxwell cursed under his breath, grabbing the USB drive as the laptop finished copying the files. The broker reappeared, his own weapon drawn. "You're out of time, Maxwell. You should have taken the deal." Maxwell ducked as a shot rang out, the bullet slamming into the bookshelf behind him. He fired back, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The two men exchanged fire, the room erupting into chaos as books and glass shattered around them. Maxwell's adrenaline surged, his focus razor-sharp. He spotted a fire escape plan mounted on the wall and made a split-second decision. Using the desk as cover, he sprinted toward the door, firing blindly behind him to keep the broker pinned down. He burst into the hallway, the sound of heavy boots echoing as guards converged on his location. Maxwell ran, his mind racing. He couldn't fight them all, but he didn't need to. He just needed to get out, with the files. A staircase loomed ahead, and he took it 2 steps at a time, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. The alarms were deafening now, the estate alive with shouts and chaos. He reached the ground floor, darting through the labyrinthine halls toward the exit. A guard lunged at him from the side, but Maxwell dropped him with a clean shot to the shoulder. The front door was just ahead, but more guards were closing in fast. Maxwell spotted a side door leading to the garage. He changed course, slamming through the door and finding himself in a vast space filled with luxury cars. He jumped into the nearest vehicle, a sleek black sedan, and hotwired it in seconds. The engine roared to life just as the guards burst into the garage. Bullets ricocheted off the car as Maxwell floored the gas, smashing through the garage door and into the night. The car fishtailed before finding its grip, speeding down the estate's long driveway. Headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, SUVs giving chase. Maxwell gritted his teeth, his focus unwavering. He had the ledger, the files, and a chance to bring the society to its knees. But first, he had to survive the night. Hours later, Maxwell stood in a nondescript office, the files spread out before a group of journalists from an independent investigative outlet. He had chosen them carefully, people he knew couldn't be bought or intimidated. "This is everything," Maxwell said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "Names, accounts, operations. The world needs to see this." The journalists exchanged glances before nodding. "We'll publish it," one of them said. "But you know they'll come after you." Maxwell nodded grimly. "Let them. As long as the truth gets out, it's worth it." As he stepped out into the cold morning light, Maxwell knew the fight wasn't over. The Black Hollow Society would strike back, and the broker was still out there. But for the first time, Maxwell felt something he hadn't in years: hope. He had struck a blow against the shadows, and now the world was watching. And sometimes, that was enough to turn the tide.